Silence fills the ancient throne room, where emperors once received ambassadors from Rome and Persia. Massive granite pillars, carved with symbols of a forgotten script, support nothing but empty air and centuries of dust. Through shattered windows, morning light illuminates where golden coins once clinked in merchants' hands from 3 continents. Wild grass pushes through marble floors that knew the footsteps of kings whose names commanded respect across the ancient world. This is Aksum, the African empire that history forgot. For 8 centuries, Ethiopian rulers projected power from highland strongholds to Red Sea ports, controlling trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. They carved monuments that pierced the sky like granite prayers, built a civilization sophisticated enough to humble pharaohs, yet vanished so completely that even legends struggle to preserve their memory. High above the burning sands of the Red Sea coast, where the desert meets the sky in shimmering waves of heat, the Ethiopian peaks rise like the backbone of gods. Here, in this realm where eagles soar between summits crowned with mist, where ancient waters carve gorges deep as wounds through granite and basalt, the foundations of Africa's first great empire take root in soil blessed by celestial rains. The land itself speaks of divine favor. While Egypt's children depend upon the Nile's annual flood and Mesopotamia's kings pray for waters that may run dry, these uplands drink from clouds that gather like offerings around sacred peaks. Teff grows golden in terraced fields carved into cliffsides, its tiny grains more precious than silver to those who know its worth. Barley waves in elevated meadows where cattle graze fat on grasses that never know drought. The very stones beneath bare feet hold ore, waiting for the smith's fire, while streams wash precious metal from rocky hearts into the waiting hands of kings yet unborn. From these blessed heights, ancient paths wind downward through escarpments where baboons call across morning mists, threading between thorn forests and ancient sycamores until they reach the shores of the Red Sea itself. Here, where the water burns like molten copper under the African sun, harbors shelter ships bearing treasures from lands beyond the horizon. Frankincense trees bleed precious tears in hidden defiles, while merchants' caravans wind through passes known only to those born to these peaks. This is the stage upon which empire will rise, a land positioned like a key between the Mediterranean world and the mysteries of inner Africa, between the spice paths of India and the precious metal roads of the Nile. But in these early centuries, when Rome still dreams of conquest and Jerusalem's temple gleams with Solomon's splendor, the uplands know only scattered realms, their rulers building in stone what their children will inherit in legend. Deep in the gorges, where ancient waters once ran fuller than today, the builders of Diemt raise monuments that will outlast their memory. Their massive blocks, cut with precision that would humble later craftsmen, rise into sanctuaries where prayers ascend to gods whose names time will swallow. These are not the crude works of farmers, but the calculated achievements of rulers who understand that stone speaks longer than bronze, that architecture argues more persuasively than armies. At Yeha, where the morning sun first touches the Ethiopian peaks, a sanctuary rises that will stand when the pharaohs are dust and Caesar's eagles have fallen. Massive limestone blocks, each weighing more than 10 strong men can lift, fit together without mortar, yet hold tighter than bonds of steel. The builders know secrets of leverage and transport that would astound the engineers of Alexandria, yet they leave no inscriptions to boast of their knowledge. The structure itself becomes their signature, written in stone that will endure until the peaks themselves wear away. The sacred attendants who serve in these elevated sanctuaries speak words borrowed from across the Red Sea, where Sabaean realms flourish in the incense groves of Arabia. Ships carry more than commercial goods between these shores. They bear the seeds of script and ceremony, the building blocks of civilization itself. The angular letters that will become Gye's take shape on clay tablets in these early centuries, each character carved with the careful precision of scribes who know that written words hold power beyond the sword's edge. But influence flows both ways, across the narrow sea. While Arabian traders bring their written language and architectural knowledge to the uplands, Ethiopian dealers carry treasures that will reshape the ancient world's understanding of riches: precious metal dust filtered from elevated streams, ivory hewn from elephants that once thundered through forests now vanished, exotic woods whose fragrance intoxicates foreign courts. These African gifts purchase respect from realms that measure worth in military might. In workshops hidden in rocky defiles, smiths master the transformation of ore into tools and weapons. The secret of smelting, closely guarded by clans who pass knowledge from father to son, gives these peoples advantages their enemies cannot match. Metal-tipped spears pierce bronze shields. Forged blades cut through copper swords like fire through wax. The sound of hammers ringing against anvils echoes through gorges where antelope leap and eagles hunt. The music of technology that will forge empires. Terraced fields step down cliffsides like stairs for giants, each level carved from living rock and filled with soil carried in baskets from distant fields. The farmers who build these agricultural miracles understand principles of irrigation and drainage that would impress the engineers of Babylon. Water flows through channels cut with mathematical precision, ensuring that every seed receives its share of seasonal rains. Barley and teff flourish in impossible places, turning vertical wilderness into gardens that feed thousands. The peoples themselves grow strong on this abundance. Their children run through settlements where the air burns clean in their lungs, where muscles develop under the constant challenge of climbing toward the sky. Warriors trained on these peaks move like cats when they descend to fight in the lowlands, their endurance forged by altitude that leaves foreign enemies gasping for breath they cannot catch. Commercial paths begin as footpaths worn smooth by centuries of caravans, salt, white as silver, and precious as gems to peoples who live far from the sea, travels from the desert depressions where it crystallizes under merciless suns. The men who cut these mineral treasures from the earth work under conditions that would kill softer breeds, their skin burned dark as copper, their eyes narrowed against glare that could blind the unwary. Yet they sing as they work, knowing that every block will purchase cattle, grain, or wives in the elevated markets. Ivory flows down these same paths, torn from elephants whose tusks have grown through decades of patient feeding in acacia forests. The hunters who bring down these giants possess courage that borders on madness, facing beasts that can crush a man with one careless step. Their spears must find the exact spot behind the great ear where death waits, or they themselves become offerings to the gods of the hunt. The ivory they win feeds networks that stretch from the mountains of the moon to the palaces of distant emperors. Precious metal dust, winnowed from streams with patience that spans generations, fills leather pouches that travel under armed guard, through passes where bandits wait like vultures. The prospectors who wash this treasure from gravels understand currents and deposits as intimately as lovers know each other's bodies. They read the landscape like scribes read sacred scrolls, knowing where the peak's blood flows richest, where fortune waits for those brave enough to claim it. Frankincense and myrrh, the tears of trees that grow in only the most favored defiles, command prices that humble kings. These sacred resins burn on altars from Egypt's shrines to Rome's household hearths, their smoke carrying prayers toward heaven, with perfume that the gods themselves find sweet. The collectors who gather these precious drops must know the exact moment when the tree's wound will yield its treasure, must understand the subtle differences between varieties that separate fortune from poverty. The men who control these early networks grow wealthy beyond the dreams of farmers. They build houses of carefully fitted blocks, their walls decorated with bronze ornaments that catch and throw back the sun like captured fire. Their wives wear jewelry of precious metal and silver. Their children play with toys carved from ivory by craftsmen whose skill passes from generation to generation. Yet prosperity brings responsibility as surely as rainfall brings floods. Chiefs who control strategic defiles begin to understand that prosperity requires protection. The caravans that bring riches to markets also attract raiders from the lowlands, desperate men who would rather steal than exchange goods, warriors who serve lords with ambitions larger than their domains. Defense becomes as crucial as production, military organization as important as agricultural innovation. Alliances form between rulers, like treaties between distant realms. A chief who controls salt-producing regions joins forces with another who commands grain-rich uplands. Together, they can field armies large enough to protect their combined territories, strong enough to punish raiders who threaten the paths that feed their prosperity. These early confederations plant the seeds of imperial thinking, the understanding that unity brings strength beyond the sum of its parts. Religious practices evolve alongside political structures, the two growing together like vines on the same tree. The gods who watch over these peoples demand more than simple offerings. They require elaborate ceremonies that only prosperous communities can afford. Sacred attendants who serve these deities must be fed and housed. Sanctuaries must be built and maintained. Festivals must be celebrated with splendor that demonstrates divine favor. Believers make their way through mountain passes to reach the sanctuary at Yeha, which has become a revered destination of pilgrimage. They bring offerings of grain and livestock, precious metals and ivory, creating a treasury that rivals those of established realms. The attendants who administer these riches develop systems of record-keeping and distribution that will serve as models for later imperial bureaucracies. Sacred and secular power intertwine like lovers' arms, each strengthening the other until separation becomes impossible. Carvers working on sanctuary walls develop artistic styles that will influence sculptors for centuries to come. Their hammers and chisels transform blank granite into scenes of religious ceremony, their skill immortalizing rites that might otherwise vanish with those who perform them. These carved surfaces become libraries for those who cannot read written words, textbooks for those who learn history through images rather than script. The bronze workers who create sanctuary furnishings master techniques that will make their descendants famous throughout the ancient world. Incense burners, ceremonial vessels, ritual weapons. Each piece reflects understanding of metallurgy that rivals the best works of Syrian and Egyptian craftsmen. The copper and tin required for these creations arrives through networks that span continents, proof that these peoples participate in exchanges that connect the known world. Musicians who perform in sacred ceremonies develop styles that blend local traditions with melodies learned from foreign dealers. Drums carved from single tree trunks carry rhythms that make listeners' hearts beat in harmony with the peak's pulse. Lyres strung with gut from cattle sing songs that mix local legends with tales heard in distant markets. The musical traditions taking root in these defiles will echo through generations, becoming the soundtrack for imperial celebrations yet to come. Marriage alliances between ruling families create networks of kinship that span the uplands like webs spun by giant spiders. a daughter from the salt regions marries a son from the precious metal streams, binding their peoples together with bonds stronger than military conquest. Children born of these unions inherit claims to territories scattered across the peaks, their bloodlines creating maps that will guide future expansion. As stories are retold across generations, the oral traditions preserving history grow ever more textured and resonant. Storytellers who perform at wedding feasts and funeral ceremonies memorize genealogies that stretch back to the first ancestors, epic poems that celebrate heroes whose deeds have grown larger than life. These living libraries carry forward the cultural DNA of peoples who will one day rule from the Red Sea to the Nile, their voices preserving wisdom that written scrolls might lose to fire or flood. Languages begin to merge and evolve as peoples interact with Red Sea dealers. Cushitic words combine with Semitic vocabulary, creating linguistic alloys stronger than their component parts. The script that will become Giez emerges from this cultural fusion, its characters adapted from Sabaean models but shaped by local needs. The ability to write opens new possibilities for administration, commerce, and diplomacy that purely oral societies cannot match. Young warriors trained in fighting techniques learn to adapt their tactics to lowland battlefields. The hit-and-run strategies that work against raiders must be modified for fighting on open ground against disciplined formations. Weapons designed for rocky terrain require adjustment for desert combat. The military knowledge accumulating in these communities will prove invaluable when their descendants face the legions of Rome and the armies of Persia. Agricultural innovations spread between communities, like favorable winds carrying seeds to fertile ground. A technique for terracing steep slopes, developed in one region, appears in distant settlements within a few planting seasons. Methods for preserving grain through winters travel along paths faster than the dealers who carry other goods. The accumulated agricultural wisdom creates surpluses that will support urban populations and professional armies. Craft specialization increases as communities grow prosperous enough to support artisans who work full-time at their occupations. Potters develop styles that will influence ceramic traditions for centuries. Weavers create textiles whose patterns encode cultural meanings that only initiates can read. Leatherworkers perfect techniques for preparing hides that will equip armies and adorn palaces. Each craft tradition becomes a thread in the cultural fabric that binds communities together. The proto-Aksumite elite, who will eventually unify these scattered settlements, begin to emerge from this matrix of commerce, religion, and warfare. They are the chiefs who control the most profitable paths, the sacred attendants who serve the most powerful gods, the warriors who win the most decisive victories. Their authority derives not from ancient bloodlines, but from demonstrated competence, making them natural leaders for peoples who value achievement over ancestry. These emerging leaders understand that lasting power requires more than military might. They patronize the craftsmen whose works beautify their palaces, support the attendants whose ceremonies legitimate their rule, protect the dealers whose activities fill their treasuries. Their courts become centers of learning, where techniques from distant lands merge with local innovations, creating hybrid technologies that surpass their origins. Female rulers appear among these proto-Aksumite chiefs, their authority based on the same combination of prosperity, religious sanction, and military success that empowers their male counterparts. Queens, who control key paths, command respect from peoples who judge leaders by their results rather than their gender. Their courts become famous for the luxury of their furnishings and the wisdom of their counselors, attracting ambitious young nobles from throughout the uplands. Religious synthesis that will characterize later Aksumite culture begins in these early centuries. Local deities merge with Sabian gods brought by Red Sea dealers, creating pantheons that reflect the multicultural nature of these emerging communities. Ceremonies that once served purely local purposes expand to accommodate worshippers from distant defiles, becoming regional celebrations that bind diverse peoples together through shared observance. Diplomatic contacts with Arabian realms across the Red Sea become more frequent and sophisticated. Local rulers send embassies to Sabaean courts, learning protocols that will serve them well in later negotiations with Roman and Persian diplomats. The gifts they offer, precious metals, ivory, exotic animals, establish their reputations as valuable allies whose friendship brings tangible benefits. Military technology continues to advance as smiths experiment with new alloys and weapon designs. Spear points become longer and sharper, shields lighter but stronger, swords more perfectly balanced for local fighting styles. The warriors who wield these improved weapons develop tactics that maximize their advantages, creating military traditions that will serve imperial armies for centuries to come. As the first century of the Common Era dawns, the stage is set for the rise of Aksum proper. The scattered realms possess the technological knowledge, accumulated prosperity, cultural sophistication, and military capability needed to forge an empire. Networks stretch across the known world. Religious institutions provide frameworks for governance. Agricultural surpluses support specialized populations, and military traditions ensure the ability to defend what has been built. The transformation from chiefdoms to Red Sea Empire awaits only the emergence of rulers with vision large enough to encompass the possibilities that surround them. Those rulers stand ready in the wings of history, their names still unknown, but their destiny written in the carved sanctuaries, precious commercial goods, and forged weapons that their ancestors have prepared for them. On the wind drifts the perfume of frankincense and the clang of hammer to iron, the echo of empire rising from the work of lost heroes whose greatest tribute is the civilization they helped shape. Soon, very soon, the name of Aksum will echo from the courts of Rome to the palaces of Persia, as the upland realm takes its place among the great powers of the ancient world. The dawn of the 2nd century breaks over a transformed landscape. Where once scattered chieftains ruled from hilltop fortresses, now a single name echoes from the Red Sea shores to the furthest reaches of Tigray, Aksum. The city rises like a jewel set in the crown of Africa, its towers catching the first light while merchants' caravans wind through its gates, bearing treasures from 3 continents. In the sovereign compound, where massive stelae thrust skyward like fingers of the gods, King Gadarat holds assembly with the confidence of one born to rule empires. His name, carved in Ge'ez script on monuments that will outlast his bones, speaks of supremacy earned through conquest and wisdom proven in governance. The scattered peoples of the northern uplands have bent their knees to this monarch, not through fear alone, but through recognition that unity brings strength. Their ancestors never dreamed possible. The process of unification unfolds like the gradual joining of streams into a mighty river. Village elders who once guarded their independence jealously now send their sons to serve in the imperial guard. Chiefs who commanded only narrow defiles find themselves governors of provinces that stretch beyond the horizon. The bonds that tie these diverse peoples together are forged not merely in conquest, but in shared prosperity, common purpose, and the intoxicating vision of dominion that grows with each passing season. Gadarat's campaigns sweep across Tigray, like wildfire consuming dry grass. His warriors hardened by generations of conflict and strengthened by the finest weapons Ethiopian smiths can forge, prove irresistible to forces that lack their discipline and equipment. Yet this is no mere battlefield conquest. It is the calculated growth of a sovereign who understands that lasting supremacy requires more than victories alone. Each newly conquered territory receives not occupation, but integration. Local customs that do not conflict with imperial governance remain untouched. Regional dialects continue alongside the spreading influence of the Highland script. The gods of subject peoples find places in expanding pantheons, their shrines maintained alongside sanctuaries dedicated to Ethiopian deities. This policy of inclusion creates loyalty where harsh rule would breed only resentment and rebellion. The king's dominion extends northward into what future ages will call Eritrea, where the Red Sea pounds against rocky shores and fishing villages cluster around protected harbors. Here, among peoples who have learned seamanship from necessity and navigation from survival, Gedarat's emissaries find willing allies rather than stubborn enemies. The promise of protection for their vessels and guaranteed markets for their catches proves more persuasive than any threat of armed action. Coastal communities that accept Ethiopian sovereignty discover benefits that far outweigh the burdens of taxation and service. Their young men serve in fleets that venture further from shore than any fisherman's boat, learning skills that transform humble coastal dwellers into masters of Red Sea navigation. Their harbors become stops on commercial networks that bring foreign goods to their markets and carry local products to distant shores. At the heart of this expanding crown lies the great port, standing sentinel over the slim passage between Africa and Arabia. When Ethiopian forces first approach its walls, the city's leaders face a choice that will determine not merely their own fate, but the future course of Red Sea commerce. They can resist and face siege by forces that have proven their strength across Tigray, or they can negotiate and potentially profit from alliance with this rising realm. Wisdom prevails over pride. The harbour opens its gates to Ethiopian governance, not as conquered territory, but as willing partner in an enterprise that promises to reshape the ancient world's understanding of African supremacy. The port's existing networks, built over centuries of patient development, merge with Highland ambitions to create commercial possibilities that stagger the imagination of contemporary observers. Within a generation, this strategic harbour transforms from regional port to international entrepot. Ships that once carried modest cargoes between coastal settlements now bear treasures destined for Rome's markets and Byzantium's palaces. The anchorage that previously sheltered fishing boats and local merchants' vessels now accommodates ocean-going craft whose holds carry the riches of 3 continents. The periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that invaluable guide for ancient mariners, records the presence of King Zoskales, whose name has reached even distant shores. Greek merchants who dock at the great port speak of this sovereign with the respect due to a leader whose domains stretch far inland and whose supremacy commands recognition from peoples they cannot even name. The fact that Mediterranean texts acknowledge Ethiopian strength demonstrates how far this African realm's influence has spread. Zoskales himself embodies the cosmopolitan character that will define Highland leadership for centuries to come. Equally comfortable negotiating with Arabian princes and Roman merchants, fluent in languages that span continents, knowledgeable about customs that govern assemblies from Persia to Egypt, he represents a new breed of African sovereign, one whose vision encompasses the entire known world, rather than merely local concerns. From across the realm, aspiring young nobles flock to the sovereign assembly at Aksum, drawn by promise and prestige. Here, surrounded by luxury that rivals anything found in Alexandria or Antioch. The future leaders of provinces and legions learn the arts of governance, negotiation, and warfare. The palace schools that train these administrators create a governing class whose loyalty flows directly to the crown and whose competence ensures effective rule across vast territories. Armed organization undergoes revolution as scattered tribal forces merge into disciplined imperial legions. The traditional warrior bands that served individual chiefs transform into professional regiments, equipped with standardized weapons and trained in coordinated tactics. Infantry formations that can stand against any enemy in Africa learn to maneuver with precision that would impress Roman centurions. Cavalry units mounted on horses bred for endurance rather than speed develop techniques perfectly adapted to Highland warfare. The introduction of currency marks perhaps the most visible symbol of Ethiopian strength and sophistication. Golden pieces bearing the sovereign image and inscriptions circulate from Red Sea ports to Nile trading posts, their weight and purity guaranteed by imperial oversight. Silver specimens facilitate smaller transactions, while bronze examples serve daily commerce, creating a monetary system that rivals those of established empires. These metallic messengers tell stories beyond their monetary value. The images they bear, sovereign portraits, spiritual symbols, architectural monuments, carry Ethiopian culture wherever merchants travel. International assemblies that receive these golden ambassadors understand immediately that they deal with no primitive chieftain, but with the representative of a civilization that commands respect through demonstrated achievement. Metal of great value fuels the monetary system, drawn from sources that multiply with every year of growth. New mining sites discovered in conquered territories supplement the traditional sources that have enriched Highland peoples for generations. Improved techniques for extracting and refining treasure increase yields while reducing the labor required for production. The sovereign treasury grows fat on revenues that would make pharaohs envious. Silver arrives through commerce rather than conquest, carried by merchants who recognize Aksum's growing importance in regional networks. The realm's strategic position between African sources of exotic goods and Mediterranean markets hungry for luxury ensures that precious metals flow naturally toward Ethiopian coffers. Each specimen that enters the domain through legitimate exchange represents not merely riches but international recognition of commercial significance. Bronze production increases dramatically as workshops expand to meet the demands of growing legions and ambitious construction projects. The copper required arrives through established networks, while tin comes from sources as distant as Britain, proof that Ethiopian merchants participate in exchanges that span the known world. Local smiths who once struggled to obtain raw materials now work with abundance that enables unprecedented creativity. The development of Highland script from its Sabaean origins reflects the realm's growing confidence in its own identity. While maintaining enough similarity to facilitate communication with Arabian partners, the evolving writing system adapts to express concepts and sounds unique to Ethiopian languages. Scribes who master this script become influential figures in their own right, their literacy enabling the complex administration that dominion requires. Carved texts begin to appear on monuments throughout the realm, their messages proclaiming sovereign achievements and divine favor in words that will endure long after their authors have joined the ancestors. These stone records serve multiple purposes. They celebrate specific accomplishments, demonstrate imperial strength to illiterate subjects, and provide permanent archives for future reference. The stones themselves become libraries that preserve official history against the ravages of time. Stone records bearing Highland script Greek, and Sabaics speak to the far-reaching, cosmopolitan spirit of Ethiopian civilization. Sovereign pronouncements that address domestic audiences in the native writing simultaneously communicate with international readers through familiar languages. This linguistic versatility enables correspondence with assemblies throughout the known world, while maintaining distinct identity. Spiritual life evolves as the realm expands to encompass peoples with diverse traditions. The sovereign pantheon grows to accommodate deities from conquered territories, while maintaining the primacy of traditional Ethiopian gods. Festivals that once served purely local communities expand into realm-wide celebrations that reinforce political unity through shared experience. Solar symbolism becomes particularly prominent in sovereign iconography, reflecting both ancient traditions and contemporary political needs. The sun's daily journey across Ethiopian skies provides metaphors for imperial governance that extends over vast territories. Currency bearing solar images carries this symbolism throughout the domain and beyond, associating Ethiopian strength with celestial forces that command universal respect. Lunar imagery complements solar symbolism in complex theological systems that reflect the sophisticated character of Ethiopian thought. The moon's phases provide calendrical frameworks for ceremonial and administrative purposes, while its nocturnal presence offers protection during the dangerous hours when evil spirits roam. Sovereign regalia, incorporating both solar and lunar elements, demonstrates mastery over all aspects of temporal and spiritual governance. Divine kingship concepts borrowed from various sources merge into distinctly Ethiopian forms of sovereign ideology. The monarch rules not merely through human oversight, but as representative of celestial forces whose will he embodies and interprets. This theological foundation for political strength creates loyalty that transcends mere personal allegiance or tribal obligation. Monumental architecture reaches new heights as sovereign resources enable construction projects that dwarf previous achievements. The great stelae that will become Aksum's most famous landmarks begin to rise during this period, their carved surfaces telling stories of imperial strength and divine favor in stone that will endure for millennia. Each new structure surpasses its predecessors in height, complexity, and artistic sophistication. The techniques required for quarrying, transporting, and erecting these massive structures represent technological achievements that rival anything accomplished in the ancient world. Engineers who plan these projects must solve problems of leverage, transportation, and construction that challenge the limits of available knowledge. The successful completion of each edifice demonstrates not merely sovereign riches, but the technical competence of Ethiopian civilization. Tomb construction becomes increasingly elaborate, as burials require facilities appropriate to monarchs whose governance spans continents. Underground chambers carved from living rock provide eternal homes for leaders whose earthly achievements deserve immortal commemoration. The precious goods buried with these sovereigns, golden vessels, ivory carvings, bronze weapons, create time capsules that preserve examples of Ethiopian craftsmanship for future discovery. Palace architecture evolves to accommodate the complex requirements of imperial administration. Reception halls where ambassadors present credentials must display prosperity and sophistication appropriate to a major force. Private quarters where families live must provide comfort and security befitting their exalted status. Administrative buildings where the business of governance proceeds must facilitate the efficient processing of information from throughout the realm. International recognition arrives as distant assemblies acknowledge Ethiopian strength through exchanges. Roman authors who mention the realm in their works demonstrate that its reputation has reached the highest levels of Mediterranean civilization. Persian officials who negotiate with Ethiopian representatives recognize them as equals in discussions that affect the balance of influence throughout the region. The realm's position between Roman and Persian spheres of influence creates opportunities for maneuvering that skilled monarchs exploit to maximum advantage. By maintaining friendly relations with both forces while committing exclusively to neither, Aksum secures benefits from each without becoming subordinate to either. This balancing act requires negotiating skill of the highest order and produces results that enhance sovereign prestige throughout the known world. Commercial agreements negotiated with distant forces establish Ethiopian merchants as respected participants in international exchanges. Their goods appear in markets from Alexandria to Constantinople. Their agents operate warehouses in ports throughout the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Their ships carry cargoes that compete successfully with products from more established sources. The realm's commercial success translates directly into political influence, as distant leaders recognize the benefits of maintaining good relations with this rising strength. Arabian connections prove particularly valuable as Ethiopian influence extends across the Red Sea toward the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia. Marriages between families create kinship bonds that facilitate commercial and strategic cooperation. Exchanges that bring Arabian scholars to Ethiopian assemblies and send Highlands students to Arabian centers of learning create intellectual networks that enrich both civilizations. During these formative centuries, the pattern of intervening in Himyarite matters begins, driven by sovereigns eager to expand their reach into Arabian political life. Support for favored claimants to disputed thrones creates obligations that can be called upon when circumstances require assistance. The establishment of client relationships with Arabian leaders provides buffers against potential enemies, while creating sources of valuable intelligence about regional developments. Weapons technology continues to advance as workshops experiment with new arms and armor designs. The distinctive Ethiopian sword, perfectly balanced for Highland fighting techniques, becomes a sought-after import in distant markets, where connoisseurs appreciate its superior craftsmanship. Spear points forged with techniques that produce edges sharper than razors give Ethiopian infantry advantages that prove decisive in countless engagements. Archery develops into an art that rivals the skills of Nubian bowmen and Scythian horse archers. The composite bows crafted in workshops combine materials and techniques that produce weapons capable of penetrating any armor available to contemporary enemies. The arrows they shoot, fletched with eagle feathers and pointed with steel, carry death across distances that place their targets beyond effective retaliation. Naval capabilities expand as coastal populations contribute their maritime expertise to fleets. Warships designed specifically for Red Sea conditions combine the best features of various traditions into vessels that can outfight any enemy and outrun any pursuer. The crews who man these ships learn navigation techniques that enable operations far from familiar shores, while maintaining the ability to return safely to home ports. As the 3rd century approaches, Aksum stands poised to claim its place among the great forces of the ancient world. The realm possesses armed strength sufficient to defend its interests, commercial networks that generate immense prosperity, connections that provide access to distant assemblies, and sophistication that commands international respect. The foundations laid during these crucial centuries will support the imperial edifice that rises to dominate the Red Sea region and influence events throughout the known world. The stage is set for the golden age that approaches, when Ethiopian strength will reach its zenith under sovereigns whose names echo through the ages. The transformation from Highland chieftaincy to international force stands complete, awaiting only the emergence of monarchs with vision grand enough to seize the opportunities that surround them. Those leaders stand ready in the wings of history, their destiny written in the golden currency, carved structures, and agreements that their predecessors have prepared for them. Across the 3rd century's final decades emerges a sovereign whose name will echo through eternity, like thunder rolling across mountain peaks. Izana ascends to the throne of his fathers, not as mere inheritor of accumulated glories, but as architect of an age that transforms Aksum from regional dominion into a force that commands respect from Rome's senators and Persia's Shah and Shahs. His reign marks the moment when African ambition achieves its fullest expression, when Highland dreams become Mediterranean realities. Within the carved stone chambers beneath Aksum's towering stele, where shadows dance with flickering lamplight and incense smoke carries prayers toward heaven, the young monarch receives the sacred regalia of his ancestors. Golden diadems that encircle his brow bear symbols older than memory, solar discs that proclaim divine favor, lunar crescents that promise eternal renewal, serpent forms that speak of wisdom transcending mortal understanding. Yet even as he honors ancient traditions, the new ruler's eyes burn with visions that stretch far beyond the horizons his forefathers knew. Transformation begins immediately. Where previous sovereigns ruled through councils of Highland chiefs and coastal merchants, this visionary establishes governing systems that would humble the bureaucrats of Alexandria. Provincial governors, appointed for competence rather than birth, carry imperial commands to territories that span from the Nubian deserts to the Eritrean shores. Tax collectors, who answer directly to the central treasury, ensure that wealth flows steadily toward the capital, funding ambitions that grow larger with each passing season. Armed reorganization follows bureaucratic reform, like lightning follows thunder. Scattered levies that served earlier campaigns merge into professional legions, trained to standards that rival Rome's finest. Infantry regiments, equipped with weapons forged in royal workshops, learn to fight in formations that can shatter any enemy force in Africa. Cavalry squadrons mounted on horses bred for both speed and endurance develop tactics perfectly suited to highland terrain and lowland battlefields alike. Arsenal development that equips these forces reflects technological advances that place the realm among the most sophisticated civilizations of its age. Smiths, working in workshops carved from living rock forge blades, whose edges hold their sharpness through countless battles. Armorers create protective gear that turns aside enemy weapons while allowing freedom of movement essential for Highland fighting techniques. Siege engineers design machines capable of reducing any fortress their enemies might construct. First great campaigns target the ancient realm of Meroe, that stubborner survivor of Kushite glory, whose pyramids still pierce the Nubian sky like accusing fingers. For centuries, the successors of Candace have maintained their independence through diplomatic cunning and combat skill, playing greater powers against each other while preserving their own autonomy. But Aksumite ascendancy upsets these ancient calculations, creating new realities that render old strategies obsolete. Conflict that erupts between highland and desert forces represents more than territorial ambition. It embodies the clash between Africa's emerging future and its glorious past. Meroe's warriors, inheritors of combat traditions that stretch back to the pharaohs, fight with the desperate courage of men defending their civilization's final hour. Iron-tipped spears gleam in desert sunlight while their shields bear symbols that were ancient when Rome was founded. Courage alone cannot overcome the advantages that Aksumite forces bring to this struggle. Royal legions advance with the methodical precision of engineers solving mathematical problems, their movements coordinated through communication systems that span vast distances. Supply trains that stretch for miles ensure that soldiers receive food, water, and weapons, regardless of battlefield conditions. Intelligence networks that penetrate enemy territories provide information that renders Meroitic strategies transparent. Siege warfare that unfolds at Meroe itself demonstrates mastery of engineering principles. Aksumite forces surround the ancient capital, with earthworks that cut off all outside assistance while protecting besiegers from counterattacks. Siege engines, whose design incorporates lessons learned from Roman and Persian models, pound the city's walls with stones that shatter even the finest masonry. Tunnels dug by miners who learned their craft in Highland copper workings undermine defensive positions that have withstood previous assaults. When Meroe's walls finally crumble and royal banners flutter over pyramids built by forgotten pharaohs, the psychological impact reverberates throughout the known world. Here stands proof that African forces can triumph over civilizations whose antiquity commanded universal respect. Diplomats from Rome and Persia who witness these events send urgent dispatches to their capitals, warning that a new player has entered the great game of international politics. Captured treasuries in Meroe stagger even Aksumite accountants accustomed to abundance. Golden artifacts crafted by Kushite artisans, whose skill rivaled anything produced in Alexandria, fill wagon after wagon, bound for royal vaults. Ivory carvings that preserve the artistic traditions of centuries become trophies in Highland palaces. Libraries containing scrolls written in scripts that few can read provide scholars with materials for decades of study. More valuable than material plunder, however, are the territories that victory adds to royal dominion. Nile corridors that stretch northward toward Egypt become highways for imperial commerce, their ancient trading posts now serving Aksumite merchants rather than Kushite rivals. Desert oases that control caravan paths fall under Highland administration, their wells and date palms supporting forces that project influence deep into African heartlands. Integration of Nubian populations into the expanding realm demonstrates sophisticated approaches to governance that characterize this administration. Rather than imposing customs through force, imperial policy encourages gradual assimilation through incentives that make cooperation more profitable than resistance. Local nobles who accept royal sovereignty retain their estates and social positions, while gaining access to wider markets and greater opportunities. Spiritual tolerance proves particularly effective in winning Nubian loyalty. Ancient shrines dedicated to Kushite deities continue functioning under royal protection, their clergy receiving support that ensures continuity of traditional ceremonies. Festivals that celebrate local gods merge gradually with Aksumite celebrations, creating syncretic traditions that bind diverse populations together through shared experiences. Even as legions celebrate victory over Africa's most ancient civilization, events unfold in the Highland capital that will reshape not merely this reign, but the entire future of the realm. In chambers where lamplight flickers against carved stone walls, where the scent of frankincense mingles with whispered prayers, a transformation begins that rivals any battlefield triumph in its ultimate significance. Catalyst arrives in the person of Frumentius, a young Syrian whose presence in Aksum results from circumstances that seem orchestrated by divine will itself. Captured as a child during a trading voyage gone wrong, raised in the imperial household as companion to princes, educated in languages and customs that span the known world, he embodies the cosmopolitan character that defines royal administration. Yet beneath his courtly sophistication burns a spiritual fire that will ignite changes reaching far beyond the Highlands. Beliefs that Frumentius carries in his heart represent more than personal conviction. They embody a revolutionary vision of divine human relationships that challenges every assumption upon which traditional society rests. Where ancient gods demand elaborate sacrifices and complex rituals, this new teaching speaks of divine love that requires only sincere repentance. Where traditional spirituality emphasizes the unbridgeable gap between mortal and immortal realms, this message proclaims a deity who became human to bridge that chasm forever. For the sovereign, wrestling with the immense responsibilities of imperial governance, these theological concepts offer practical as well as spiritual attractions. Doctrine that emphasizes universal brotherhood provides ideological foundations for ruling diverse populations, united only by royal authority. Teachings that stress forgiveness and redemption create frameworks for integrating former enemies into expanding society. Most compelling of all, emphasis on divine justice resonates with a monarch who seeks to establish law and order across territories that span continents. Conversion itself unfolds with ceremonies that blend local traditions with imported innovations. In chambers beneath Aksum's greatest stele, where ancient gods have received homage for countless generations, the monarch kneels before the Syrian as sacred waters flow over his royal brow. Symbolic death and rebirth that baptism represents takes on profound political significance as Africa's mightiest sovereign publicly abandons the spiritual foundations of his predecessor's authority. Transformation extends far beyond personal conviction. Within months of royal baptism, the new creed becomes the official belief system of the realm, its symbols appearing on currency and monuments throughout the dominion. Crosses replace solar and lunar imagery on metallic specimens that carry influence to markets throughout the known world. Churches rise where pagan shrines once stood, their architectural forms blending imported requirements with local building traditions. Governance implications prove equally profound. Clergy who serve the new doctrine become powerful figures in imperial administration, their literacy and organizational skills making them indispensable to rulers who must govern vast territories through written commands. Bishops appointed to major centers function as both spiritual leaders and royal representatives, their authority encompassing secular as well as sacred matters. Educational revolution follows doctrinal change, like day follows night. Schools established in connection with churches begin teaching literacy in scripts that open new worlds of knowledge to students. Libraries that preserve imported texts also collect works of philosophy, science, and history that expand intellectual horizons beyond traditional boundaries. Scholars who master these materials create a learned class whose expertise serves imperial ambitions throughout the known world. International implications of the realm's conversion resonate through diplomatic channels that span continents. Roman officials who previously regarded Aksum as merely another barbarian dominion suddenly discover shared spiritual foundations that facilitate cooperation on previously impossible levels. Persian authorities who monitor activities must recalculate their assessments based on new alliance possibilities that connections create. Commercial relationships also shift as merchants find welcome in communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Markets that previously discriminated against African products now embrace goods produced by fellow believers. Partnerships that transcend ethnic and linguistic barriers create wealth flows that strengthen the realm's position in international economics. Architectural revolution that accompanies spiritual transformation produces monuments that rival anything constructed in the ancient world. Churches carved from solid rock demonstrate engineering skills that astound contemporary observers while creating worship spaces uniquely adapted to local conditions. Monasteries, established in remote locations, become centers of learning that attract scholars from throughout the known world. Artistic traditions evolve as imported themes merge with local aesthetic sensibilities. Painters who once depicted pagan deities learn to portray biblical scenes with techniques that reflect indigenous traditions. Sculptors adapt their skills to create imagery that speaks to local audiences while maintaining theological accuracy that satisfies doctrinal requirements. Musicians develop liturgical compositions that blend foreign melodies with native rhythms. Scribal revolution that accompanies the new creed's spread transforms Geshes from a primarily bureaucratic script into a literary language capable of expressing the most sophisticated theological concepts. Translators who render biblical texts into local script must develop vocabularies that capture nuances of meaning while remaining comprehensible to audiences. Resulting literary tradition creates cultural foundations that will support civilization for millennia to come. Battlefield advantages flow from doctrinal conversion as allies provide intelligence, supplies, and diplomatic support that strengthen positions throughout the region. Pilgrim routes that connect the realm to holy sites in Palestine and Egypt become channels for information exchange that keeps imperial administrators informed about international developments. Merchants who operate throughout the Mediterranean world serve as unofficial ambassadors whose reports supplement formal diplomatic channels. Economic benefits multiply as connections open new markets and create partnerships that transcend traditional boundaries. Local products find eager buyers in communities throughout the Roman world, while foreign goods flow toward Highland markets through expanded commercial networks. Resulting prosperity funds, construction projects, and expeditions that demonstrate strength to increasingly impressed international observers. Legal transformation accompanies spiritual change as imported concepts of justice merge with traditional customs to create hybrid systems that serve imperial administration throughout diverse territories. Courts that apply new principles while respecting local traditions develop jurisprudence that maintains order across populations that span multiple cultures. Legal codes that blend biblical injunctions with practical necessities create frameworks for governance that prove remarkably durable. Diplomatic revolution follows as the realm's new identity creates alliance possibilities that reshape regional balances. Treaties negotiated with partners in the Roman world establish cooperative relationships that provide mutual benefits while deterring potential enemies. Intelligence sharing arrangements that exploit connections keep authorities informed about threats that might otherwise develop undetected. Golden age that emerges from these transformations witnesses influence reaching its historical zenith. Commercial networks that span 3 continents carry goods to markets that previous generations never imagined reaching. Correspondence flows between Aksum and Constantinople, between Highland churches and Roman basilicas, between local scholars and Alexandrian theologians. This realm that once knew only regional significance now participates as an equal in discussions that affect the destiny of the ancient world. Currency that bears, crosses alongside local imagery, circulates throughout trading networks that connect Africa to Europe and Asia. Precious metal that funds this monetary system flows from mines whose output increases with each year of expansion, while silver and bronze supplements arrive through relationships that span the known world. Economic prosperity that results enables construction projects and expeditions that demonstrate strength to increasingly respectful international audiences. As the reign approaches its conclusion, Aksum stands transformed beyond recognition. Highland chieftaincy that ancestors knew has become a dominion whose influence stretches from Nubian deserts to Arabian peninsulas, whose merchants operate in markets from Alexandria to Constantinople, whose diplomats negotiate as equals with representatives of Rome and Persia. Foundations laid during these pivotal decades will support greatness for centuries to come, ensuring that the name of Aksum echoes through history as testimony to African achievement at its most magnificent. The moment arrives for the next chapter in this epic tale, when forces will carry their banners across the Red Sea itself to reshape the political landscape of southern Arabia. What vision created stands ready to test its strength against enemies and allies alike, confident in its capabilities and secure in its divine mission. Beyond the narrow waters where monsoon winds drive vessels between African shores and peninsular coasts, ancient kingdoms wrestle with destinies that will reshape the balance of the known world. In the incense valleys of southern Arabia, where frankincense trees bleed precious resin and myrrh perfumes the desert air, the heirs of Sheba's legendary wealth find themselves caught between competing visions of divine truth and earthly dominion. Here, across the narrow straits from Aksum's highland strongholds, the stage is set for conflicts that will test African resolve against resistance from the peninsula. Himyarite princes who rule from their mountain fastnesses command domains that have known prosperity since Solomon's time. Caravans bearing spices and aromatics wind through passes controlled by their fortresses, while harbours along the coast shelter vessels that carry these treasures to markets spanning 3 continents. Yet beneath this commercial success, deeper currents of transformation flow like underground rivers, carrying changes that will revolutionize not merely political arrangements, but the spiritual foundations of society itself. Jewish communities that flourished in these valleys for generations find themselves increasingly powerful as their commercial networks expand and their influence grows among the ruling elite. Synagogues rise in cities where Arab chieftains once worshipped ancient deities, their scrolls preserving traditions that stretch back to David's time. Rabbinical schools that attract students from distant lands create centers of learning, where Hebrew wisdom merges with local knowledge to produce hybrid cultures that command respect throughout the region. Simultaneously, the new doctrine that transformed Aksum begins to penetrate peninsular lands through merchants, missionaries, and diplomatic contacts that span the narrow waters. Sacred buildings, established in coastal towns, provide gathering places for believers whose numbers grow with each passing season. Bishops sent from Byzantium and Alexandria work alongside local converts to create institutional frameworks that can support expanding communities of the faithful. Tensions that arise from these competing spiritual influences create fault lines that run deeper than mere theological disagreement. Political alliances form around doctrinal commitments as rulers choose sides based on calculations that blend personal conviction with strategic advantage. What begins as philosophical debate evolves into factional warfare that threatens to tear society apart at its very foundations. Into this volatile mixture steps Du Nuwas, a Himyarite sovereign whose name will become synonymous with oppression and whose actions will trigger interventions that reshape the entire regional balance. Rising to authority through circumstances that blend legitimate succession with violent usurpation, he embodies the fierce determination of rulers who refuse to yield to foreign influence, whether spiritual or temporal. His court becomes a fortress of Jewish orthodoxy, surrounded by enemies who grow stronger with each passing day. The royal policies that emerge from his palace reflect not merely personal conviction, but calculated strategy designed to eliminate threats to Himyarite independence. Measures that begin as restrictions on foreign worship escalate into systematic oppression that targets communities whose loyalty appears questionable. Sacred buildings that once enjoyed protection find themselves subjected to harassment that grows more severe as political pressures intensify. Events that unfold at Najran, that prosperous oasis where caravan routes converge like rivers flowing toward the sea, crystallize these tensions into actions that will echo through eternity. Here, in this commercial center, where diverse populations have long coexisted in profitable harmony, the collision between competing visions reaches its most violent expression. Local believers who refuse to abandon their convictions face choices that test faith against survival, principle against pragmatism. Violence that erupts transcends ordinary political repression to become something approaching genocide. Men, women, and children who will not renounce their beliefs find themselves facing torments that would shame the demons of hell itself. Fires that consume bodies also burn away any possibility of reconciliation, creating martyrs whose blood cries out for vengeance across the narrow waters that separate Arabia from Africa. News of these atrocities reaches Aksum through networks that span the straits like invisible bridges. Merchants who witness the carnage carry eyewitness accounts to Highland courts, where royal advisors debate appropriate responses. Refugees who escape the slaughter arrive bearing tales that inflame passions among believers, who see in this brutality a challenge to their own security and dignity. King Caleb, heir to the throne that witnessed Aksum's transformation under his predecessor, faces decisions that will determine not merely his own legacy, but the future course of regional history. Weighing moral obligations against strategic calculations, spiritual duties against political realities, he must choose between intervention that risks everything and inaction that betrays fundamental principles. His deliberations take place in chambers where incense smoke carries prayers upward, while maps spread across tables reveal the logistical challenges that any expedition must overcome. Preparations that follow royal decisions demonstrate the sophisticated capabilities that Aksum has developed over generations of expansion and warfare. Naval units that patrol coastal waters receive reinforcements drawn from the finest warriors the Highlands can produce. Ships designed for combat rather than commerce emerge from harbors, where craftsmen have labored to create vessels capable of projecting African strength across dangerous waters. Logistics required for amphibious operations challenge even Highland organizational abilities. Supplies that must sustain armies operating far from home bases require careful calculation and meticulous planning. Water, food, weapons, and replacement equipment must cross hostile waters aboard vessels that face threats from storms as well as enemies. Communications that coordinate multiple units across vast distances test systems developed for Highland warfare, but adapted to maritime requirements. Intelligence gathering that precedes action reveals both opportunities and obstacles that will shape planning. Spies who penetrate peninsular lands report on enemy strengths and weaknesses, while identifying potential allies among populations that chafe under Himyarite rule. Diplomatic contacts established with tribal leaders create possibilities for coordinated action that could multiply the effectiveness of any invasion force. When the king's fleets finally appear off the coast, their arrival marks the moment when African ambition achieves its most audacious expression. Vessels bearing the crosses and crescents of Highland authority approach shores where no African army has set foot since ancient times beyond memory. Warriors who learned their craft in mountain battles prepare to test their skills against enemies, fighting to defend their homeland against foreign invasion. Battles that follow demonstrate both the capabilities and limitations of long-distance operations. Highland troops, despite their superior equipment and training, must overcome disadvantages of terrain, climate, and local knowledge that favor defenders. Peninsular resistance, though hampered by internal divisions and inferior organization, benefits from intimate familiarity with landscapes that challenge invading armies unaccustomed to desert warfare. Victory, when it comes, results not from single decisive engagements, but from persistent pressure that gradually wears down enemy resistance. Coastal strongholds fall to combined land and naval assaults that exploit Ethiopian advantages in siege warfare. Mountain fortresses yield to blockades that cut off supplies, while bombardments breach walls that were never designed to withstand modern artillery. Gradually, systematically, the machinery of African dominion grinds forward across hostile lands. Dunuas himself meets his end in circumstances that blend heroism with futility, courage with desperation. Rather than surrender to enemies whose victory seems certain, he chooses death in battle over life in captivity. His final charge, leading loyal followers against overwhelming odds, achieves nothing beyond demonstrating that even defeated rulers can die with dignity intact. The waves that close over his body carry away the last representative of independent Himyarite sovereignty. The installation of Abraha as the royal representative in conquered domains marks the beginning of a new phase in peninsular history. This trusted general, whose loyalty has been proven in countless engagements, faces the challenge of transforming battlefield victory into lasting political control. His authority must be established over populations that include not merely defeated enemies, but potential allies whose cooperation is essential for long-term success. Policies that emerge from the new administration reflect sophisticated understanding of the complexities involved in governing distant provinces populated by diverse communities. Rather than imposing direct Highland rule, the Viceroy establishes systems that blend African authority with local traditions. Regional customs that do not conflict with imperial interests remain undisturbed, while new laws address situations that traditional frameworks cannot handle effectively. Building projects that commence under the new regime demonstrate both the resources and ambitions that characterize Ethiopian governance. Sacred structures that rise in former strongholds of oppression symbolize the triumph of the faith that intervention was meant to protect. Palaces that house administrative centers reflect the wealth and sophistication that African rule brings to peninsular lands. Roads that connect previously isolated regions facilitate commerce and communication, while enabling rapid response to any threats. Most ambitious of all these undertakings, the great edifice that the Viceroy commissions in Sana'a represents an attempt to rival the most sacred sites of the ancient world. Al-Kulays, as this magnificent structure becomes known, embodies building ambitions that challenge the supremacy of Jerusalem's temple and Mecca's sanctuary. Its soaring walls and golden decorations speak of wealth and piety, combined in proportions that astound contemporary observers. Yet even as the general consolidates Highland control over peninsular domains, seeds of future conflict take root in soil, fertilized by victory and watered with the blood of the defeated. His growing independence from Ethiopian oversight creates tensions that threaten the unity of the African realm. His ambitious projects drain resources that might better serve other imperial priorities. Most dangerously of all, his challenge to establish spiritual centers provokes reactions that will ultimately prove beyond his ability to control. Commercial policies that the new administration implements demonstrate both opportunities and dangers inherent in peninsular dominion. Caravan routes that previously served Himyarite interests now channel wealth toward Highland coffers. their profits funding projects that strengthen African control while impoverishing former beneficiaries. Harbour fees collected from merchants using coastal ports provide revenues that support garrisons and governing systems. Tribute demanded from subject communities creates streams of wealth that flow steadily across the straits toward mountain treasuries. However, these economic benefits come at costs that grow heavier with each passing year. Troops required to maintain control over restless populations drain resources that might otherwise support expansion or internal development. Governing systems needed to administer distant provinces require skilled personnel whose services are desperately needed elsewhere. Communication networks that connect peninsular domains to highland capitals demand constant maintenance and protection against enemies who never cease seeking opportunities for disruption. Cultural transformations that accompany political dominion create changes that penetrate deeper than mere governmental arrangements. Arabic-speaking populations learn to accommodate African customs while maintaining their own traditions. Building styles blend highland techniques with desert requirements to produce hybrid forms that reflect the mixed character of the new society. Literary traditions merge as scribes record local poetry in Ethiopian script while translating Highland chronicles into Arabic verse. The spiritual developments prove particularly complex as different communities adjust to changed circumstances. Sacred buildings that replace destroyed synagogues provide gathering places for believers whose numbers grow through conversion as well as immigration. Monasteries established in desert locations become centers of learning that attract scholars from throughout the region. Pilgrimage routes that connect local holy sites to African centers create networks of spiritual communication that strengthen bonds between distant provinces. Yet these positive developments occur alongside tensions that threaten the stability of the entire enterprise. Traditional practices, driven underground but not eliminated, continue to attract followers who resist foreign domination in all its forms. Jewish communities that survived the earlier violence nurse grievances that simmer like banked fires, ready to flare into open rebellion when circumstances permit. Tribal loyalties that transcend doctrinal divisions create alternative power structures that challenge official authority. Diplomatic complications multiply as other regional powers adjust to the new realities created by Ethiopian expansion. Persian authorities, who monitor developments from their own strongholds, recognize both threats and opportunities in the changed situation. Roman officials who depend on trade routes worry about disruptions that might affect their own economic interests. Byzantine leaders who share doctrinal commitments with the African invaders nevertheless harbor concerns about imperial ambitions that might threaten their own influence. Innovations that emerge from peninsular warfare demonstrate how victory drives technological development. Weapons designed for desert combat differ significantly from those developed for highland battles, requiring smiths to experiment with new materials and techniques. Naval technologies that enable operations across the straits incorporate lessons learned from encounters with local vessels and Persian warships. Siege equipment that proves effective against fortifications reflects adaptation of mountain designs to different challenges. Intelligence networks that support operations create capabilities that serve broader imperial interests. Spies who penetrate enemy lands provide information about threats that might otherwise develop undetected. Diplomatic contacts established with tribal leaders create sources of early warning about potential rebellions or foreign interventions. Commercial agents who monitor market conditions report economic developments that might affect imperial revenues or strategic planning. As decades pass and the viceroy's rule becomes entrenched, His growing autonomy creates problems that will ultimately prove insurmountable. Distance from Highland oversight enables policies that serve local interests rather than imperial priorities. Peninsular revenues that once flowed steadily toward Ethiopian treasuries begin to remain in regional accounts to fund local projects. Most ominously, troops that were originally intended to serve as instruments of imperial control gradually develop loyalties that focus on their immediate commander rather than distant sovereigns. Competitive building that culminates in the Alculays project represents more than mere construction ambition. It embodies a challenge to established hierarchies that will provoke reactions far beyond peninsular borders. By attempting to create a pilgrimage destination that rivals Mecca's ancient sanctuary, the general threatens economic and spiritual interests that have sustained society for countless generations. His magnificent edifice, however beautiful its decorations or impressive its dimensions, cannot overcome the deeper currents of tradition and identity that flow through local culture like underground rivers. Events that will follow, the famous elephant expedition that carries his ambitions toward their ultimate fulfillment and destruction, grow inevitably from seeds planted during these years of apparent success. What appears to be the consolidation of African control over peninsular lands actually represents the overextension of imperial resources and the creation of commitments that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The very success of this adventure contains within it the elements of its own ultimate failure. Yet for now, in these middle decades of the 6th century, Ethiopian banners flutter proudly over domains that span from the highlands of Africa to the incense valleys of Arabia. Merchants bearing African goods travel safely through mountain passes, where their predecessors faced constant danger. Sacred structures rise, where oppression once reigned supreme. The vision that inspired royal intervention appears to have achieved complete vindication through dominion that establishes African authority over some of the most strategically important regions in the ancient world. Tensions mount in this peninsular drama as ambition begins to outpace capability and the limits of imperial expansion are tested by forces no amount of prowess can overcome. The realm that reached its greatest territorial height through these campaigns now stands on the edge of transformations that will redefine not only its own fate, but the entire balance of influence along the coastal region, across the burning sands of central Arabia, where the desert sun beats down mercilessly on caravan routes that have carried pilgrims for generations beyond memory. An elephant trumpets its confusion as its handlers struggle to maintain direction toward a destination that grows more impossible with each passing hour. This magnificent beast, bred for war and trained for victory, embodies the hubris of men who believe that strength alone can reshape the sacred geography of the ancient world. Yet the very absurdity of its presence in this wasteland signals the beginning of transformations that will humble the mightiest realm Africa has ever known. The Viceroy's expedition against the Holy City represents more than military overreach. It symbolizes the fatal collision between earthly ambition and divine decree that destroys dominions as surely as earthquakes topple temples. His Alculays cathedral, for all its golden splendor and architectural magnificence, cannot compete with the simple black stone that draws the hearts of desert dwellers like iron filings to a magnet. No amount of imperial wealth or engineering prowess can create what the gods themselves have sanctified through centuries of pilgrimage and prayer. When the elephants retreat in defeat, trampling their own handlers in panic, as mysterious forces turn victory into catastrophe, the news spreads across Arabia like wildfire consuming dry grass. Tribal chieftains who witness the spectacle understand immediately that a new age has dawned, one in which the old certainties of imperial dominance no longer hold. The general who dreamed of redirecting the spiritual currents of Arabia finds himself swept aside by powers beyond his comprehension or control. Persian intervention that follows this debacle strikes at African positions like lightning from clear skies. Sassanid armies, long content to observe adventures from the safety of their own borders, suddenly recognize opportunities that weakness has created. Swift strikes that capture key strongholds demonstrate how quickly the balance of regional influence can shift when imperial overstretch meets determined opposition from fresh enemies. Chosroes, the Shah, whose calculating mind has long pondered the African presence in Arabia, moves with the precision of a master chess player capturing exposed pieces. His forces, hardened by generations of warfare against Romans and Turks, find garrisons weakened by years of colonial duty and demoralized by recent failures. Port cities that once flew royal banners soon witness the raising of Sassanid standards that proclaim new masters for these strategic positions. Within the space of a single campaign season, Persian triumph sweeps away the entire edifice of African control over southern Arabia. Fortresses that took decades to build fall in days to enemies who understand both the vulnerabilities and political weaknesses that imperial overextension has created. The wealth that once flowed steadily across narrow waters toward mountain treasuries now enriches Persian coffers, while funding further expansion of Sassanid influence. Simultaneously, across the mountains and deserts of the peninsular interior, a spiritual revolution begins that will transform not merely Arabia, but the entire known world. In the merchant city that weathered the elephant assault, where caravans converge and pilgrims gather around the ancient sanctuary that the general failed to eclipse, a prophet begins to preach a message that will shake the foundations of dominions. The faith that Muhammad proclaims carries within it the seeds of armed victory and political transformation that will humble both Persian shahs and African emperors. Yet even as this new doctrine spreads like flame through tinder, its early adherents find themselves facing persecution from their own kinsmen that mirrors the violence once unleashed at Najran. When oppression becomes unbearable and survival itself depends upon flight, the faithful turn their eyes toward the one realm in the region where their beliefs might find protection rather than brutality. Across the narrow waters that separate Arabia from Africa, the Christian domain represents sanctuary for believers whose lives hang in the balance. Rulers who themselves suffered under pagan persecution before their own conversion understand the plight of those who face similar trials. The decision to grant asylum to these refugees reflects not merely political calculation, but genuine spiritual kinship between communities that worship the same God despite theological differences. First Hijra, as this migration becomes known to history, brings to African shores men and women whose descendants will conquer half the known world. Among the refugees who seek shelter in coastal ports are companions of the Prophet whose names will echo through the ages. Their presence in royal courts creates connections between emerging Islamic communities and established African authority that will influence relationships for centuries to come. King al-Najashi, the sovereign who grants protection to these exiles, embodies the tolerance that has long characterized policy toward diverse subject populations. His court, where bishops and Muslim refugees find common ground in their shared monotheism, becomes a symbol of the possibility for peaceful coexistence between different branches of Abrahamic faith. The gifts he sends to Muhammad and the respect he shows for Islamic teachings establish precedents that will shape Christian-Muslim relations throughout the medieval period. However, this gesture of goodwill toward the emerging faith cannot offset the larger forces that are beginning to erode influence throughout the coastal region. The loss of peninsular territories removes crucial sources of revenue, while eliminating strategic positions that once projected African authority across vast distances. More fundamentally, the rise of Islamic naval capabilities threatens the maritime supremacy that has underpinned commercial and armed dominance for centuries. Arab fleets that emerge from newly controlled ports possess advantages that African vessels cannot match. Their crews, drawn from populations with generations of seafaring experience, navigate familiar waters with skill that foreign sailors cannot equal. Their ships, designed specifically for local conditions and equipped with the latest innovations in naval technology, outperform older vessels that once dominated these same routes. Most crucially, their captains fight with the fervor of believers convinced that divine favor supports their cause. Commercial networks that once channeled wealth toward royal treasuries gradually reorient themselves around new centers of authority and faith. Merchants who previously sought protection from African warships now turn to Arab naval forces for security. Trading posts that flew mountain banners for generations quietly transfer their allegiance to Islamic authorities, who can provide more reliable access to expanding markets. The gold that once filled treasuries begins to flow toward Damascus and Baghdad, instead of royal capitals and satellite cities. Internal pressures that have been building within the realm for decades suddenly intensify as external challenges multiply. Court factions that once competed for royal favor now question the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial policy. Regional governors who accepted central authority when it brought prosperity and security begin to assert independence as weakness becomes apparent. Clerical leaders who supported expansion when it served evangelical purposes start to advocate for consolidation when missionary zeal yields only defeat. Environmental degradation that results from centuries of intensive agriculture and population growth compounds these political and economic difficulties. Forests that once covered mountain slopes disappear as farmers clear new fields to feed expanding populations. Soil erosion that follows deforestation reduces agricultural productivity while requiring ever greater inputs of labor and resources. Rivers that once ran clear become muddy torrents that carry away the very foundation of prosperity. Climate changes that affect rainfall patterns throughout the region create additional stress on agricultural systems already stretched to their limits. Droughts that last for multiple seasons force farmers to abandon marginal lands while concentrating on more reliable areas. Floods that follow dry periods wash away terraces and irrigation works that took generations to construct. The careful balance between population and resources that sustained civilization for centuries begins to wobble toward unsustainable extremes. This period reveals the material consequences of imperial contraction in stark detail. Construction of new monuments ceases as resources previously devoted to building projects are redirected toward more immediate needs. Existing structures begin to show signs of neglect as maintenance budgets shrink under financial pressure. The workshops that once produced luxury goods for international markets reduce their output, while craftsmen seek employment in other occupations or regions. Monetary systems that once demonstrated African sophistication and wealth start to show signs of stress and debasement. Coin production falls as precious metal supplies become scarce and expensive. The weight and purity of new issues fall below traditional standards as officials struggle to maintain currency circulation with reduced resources. Foreign merchants who once eagerly accepted royal money begin to demand alternative forms of payment that reflect their waning confidence in stability. Administrative records become increasingly scarce as the bureaucratic apparatus that once efficiently governed vast territories contracts under pressure. Provincial correspondence that once flowed regularly between regional centers and the capital dwindles to occasional messages dealing with crisis situations. Tax collection, once a smoothly functioning system that generated predictable revenues, becomes sporadic and contentious, as local authorities retain increasing portions of what they gather. Armed organization undergoes fundamental changes as the professional armies that once projected influence across 3 continents adapt to reduced circumstances and changing threats. Elite units that specialized in expeditionary warfare find themselves reassigned to frontier defense as imperial ambitions yield to survival priorities. Training programs that once prepared warriors for campaigns in distant lands refocus on protecting home territories from increasingly bold raiders and rebels. Diplomatic isolation increases as former allies distance themselves from a realm whose strength is clearly waning. Persian officials who once negotiated with representatives as equals now treat diplomats with the condescension reserved for client states. Roman authorities, who previously sought cooperation in coastal affairs, begin to explore alternative arrangements that bypass African involvement entirely. Even Arab leaders, who owe their freedom to protection, start to view their former protectors as obstacles to their own expanding ambitions. Cultural transformations accompany political and economic contraction as society turns inward upon itself. Artistic traditions that once incorporated influences from across the known world become increasingly conservative and localized. Literary production shifts from celebrating imperial achievements to lamenting lost glories and vanished greatness. Music and poetry that once proclaimed supremacy throughout the region begins to echo with themes of resignation and nostalgic remembrance. Spiritual developments reflect the broader pattern of retreat and consolidation that characterizes this period. Missionary activities that once carried Christianity to distant shores cease as resources and energy focus on maintaining faith communities within contracting borders. Monasteries that served as centers of learning and cultural exchange with foreign scholars become isolated institutions that preserve knowledge rather than expanding it. Theological discussions that once engaged with international currents of thought become increasingly parochial and self-referential. Educational institutions that once attracted students from throughout the region see their enrollments shrink as political instability and economic hardship make travel dangerous and expensive. Libraries that preserve texts in multiple languages lose funding for acquisitions, while existing collections suffer from inadequate maintenance. The schools that trained administrators for imperial service adapt their curricula to prepare graduates for more modest careers in local governance or private enterprise. Commercial relationships that sustained prosperity for centuries undergo fundamental reorientation as new powers assume control over crucial routes and markets. Caravan traffic that once converged on African ports in search of goods increasingly bypasses territories in favor of more secure alternatives. The exotic products that made merchants wealthy in foreign markets face competition from suppliers who operate under the protection of ascendant Islamic authorities. Urban centers that flourished during the imperial age begin to experience population loss as residents seek opportunities elsewhere or return to rural subsistence. The cosmopolitan atmosphere that once characterized cities gives way to more homogeneous communities, as foreign merchants, craftsmen, and scholars depart for regions that offer greater security and prosperity. Public buildings that symbolized imperial grandeur stand increasingly empty as the activities they were designed to house move elsewhere or cease entirely. Regional autonomy increases as central authority weakens and local leaders assert greater independence from royal control. Provincial governors, who once implemented policies without question, begin to adapt commands to local conditions and preferences. Tribal chieftains, who accepted overlordship when it brought benefits, start to withdraw allegiance as those advantages disappear. The unified command structure that once coordinated activities across vast territories fragments into competing jurisdictions with conflicting priorities. As the 7th century draws toward its close, the realm that once commanded respect throughout the ancient world has contracted to a shadow of its former self. The mountain heartland remains secure, protected by geography and the residual loyalty of core populations, but the far-flung territories that once acknowledged supremacy have slipped away like sand through closing fingers. The dream of African dominance over coastal commerce and peninsular politics has yielded to the harsh realities of imperial overstretch and changing global circumstances. Yet even in contraction, the foundations remain for future recovery and transformation. The administrative skills developed during centuries of imperial governance survive in truncated form, ready to serve new purposes when circumstances permit. The cultural achievements that flourished under royal patronage continue to inspire new generations of artists, writers, and thinkers who will find ways to express identity within changed contexts. Most importantly, the faith that motivated expansion retains its vitality and appeal, providing spiritual foundations for whatever political structures may emerge from the wreckage of imperial ambition. A new era begins, marked by the fading of imperial grandeur and the rise of other forms of civilization. The realm that once projected its influence across continents must now discover how to preserve its essential character within more modest boundaries, how to maintain its cultural identity while adapting to a world that no longer acknowledges its supremacy, and how to find new sources of strength in spiritual rather than temporal achievements. Morning mist rises from empty courtyards, where emperors once held audiences that determined the fate of nations. Grass grows between the paving stones of palaces that hosted ambassadors from Rome and Persia, while wild birds nest in the carved capitals of columns that supported roofs echoing with the poetry of a dozen languages. Aksum, the city that gave its name to an age of African greatness, slowly surrenders its role as the beating heart of dominion, to become a repository of memories too sacred to abandon, yet too heavy to carry forward into an uncertain future. Silence creeps through administrative quarters, where scribes once labored over correspondence that reached from the Nile to the Indian Ocean. The royal chancellery, where documents bore seals that commanded respect across 3 continents, stands empty save for dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that penetrate through windows no longer glazed. Ledgers that recorded the tribute of provinces and the profits of commerce crumble on shelves that will never again bear the weight of new volumes, celebrating fresh victories or expanding prosperity. Stone monuments that proclaimed eternal glory to departed sovereigns continue their mute testimony to vanished greatness. The great stelae thrust skyward like accusing fingers, their carved surfaces telling stories in scripts that fewer and fewer can read with each passing generation. Yet even as governmental control migrates elsewhere, these granite witnesses retain their capacity to inspire awe in visitors who glimpse in their towering magnificence echoes of achievements that once shook the ancient world. The period tells its own story of gradual abandonment and partial recovery. The quality of craftsmanship declines as trade routes shrink and skilled workers leave in search of better prospects. Coins grow rarer over time, and their gold content steadily falls, revealing both a shortage of resources and the financial strain that drove currency debasement. Buildings collapse and are left in ruins, with no funds or labor available to rebuild. Yet abandonment proves neither complete nor permanent. Sacred geography that accumulated spiritual significance over centuries of royal grandeur cannot be casually discarded like worn clothing. Pilgrims continue to arrive from distant territories, drawn by devotional practices that transcend boundaries and speak to deeper hungers than mere earthly dominion can satisfy. Houses of worship that served the sovereign court adapt to minister to settlements whose needs differ from those of vanished courtiers, yet whose souls thirst for the same divine waters. Streets that once rang with the footsteps of merchants from 3 continents grow quiet except for the occasional procession of believers making their way to shrines that preserve the memory of martyrs and saints. Market squares where ivory and gold changed hands in transactions that enriched kingdoms now host modest exchanges of grain and livestock that sustain village economies. Fountains that once sparkled with waters channeled through engineering, marvels run dry as the systems that maintain them require expertise and resources no longer available. Ecclesiastical power fills the vacuum left by retreating temporal governance. Bishops who once advised emperors on matters of state find themselves serving as de facto rulers of settlements that acknowledge no other guidance. Their robes, once symbols of spiritual office, now represent the only institutional continuity that bridges the chasm between past glory and present necessity. Abbots whose institutions preserved knowledge through the chaos of collapse emerge as guardians of continuity that links present struggles to past glories. Sacred libraries that once housed scrolls in a dozen languages adapt their collections to serve reduced but still devoted readerships. Manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments give way to simpler texts copied on humbler materials, yet the essential wisdom they contain flows uninterrupted from generation to generation. Copying chambers where monks labor by candlelight become the workshops where civilization's genetic code replicates itself despite the death of its former political host. Monastic workshops that once produced luxury items for royal courts redirect their skills toward creating objects that serve spiritual rather than temporal purposes. Illuminated gospels replace diplomatic gifts, while ceremonial vessels crafted for worship supersede the golden ornaments that once adorned palaces. The techniques remain unchanged, but their application reflects the transformation of priorities that accompanies the shift from earthly to heavenly ambitions. Guerre's writing, that triumph of synthesis that enabled the administration of vast territories, transforms from a tool of bureaucracy into the sacred language of devotional expression. Manuscripts that once recorded tax collections and diplomatic correspondence now preserve biblical texts and theological treatises. Scribes who mastered their craft to serve the state adapt their skills to copying psalms and chronicles that will carry the memory of greatness into whatever future awaits beyond the current darkness. Educational practices that once trained bureaucrats for royal service evolved to prepare clergy for spiritual duties. Schools attached to houses of worship focus their curricula on theological studies, while maintaining enough secular knowledge to serve the practical needs of their settlements. Students who might once have aspired to careers in distant capitals now prepare for lives of service to their immediate neighborhoods. Yet their education preserves the intellectual standards that distinguish civilization from barbarism. Ecclesiastical institutions prove more durable than palaces or treasuries. Houses of worship carved from living rock require no maintenance beyond what devoted settlements can provide through their own labor and modest resources. Monastic establishments situated in remote locations possess the self-sufficiency that enables persistence when external support disappears. The rhythm of prayer and contemplation continues unbroken, even as the trumpets of war fall silent and the footsteps of courtiers fade into memory. Oral preservation that supplements written records becomes increasingly important as formal education contracts and reading skills decline among populations that once boasted of their sophistication. Storytellers who perform at festivals and family celebrations preserve genealogies that stretch back to legendary founders. Epic poems that celebrate heroic deeds grow richer with each retelling, their historical accuracy less important than their emotional truth in maintaining connections between present settlements and ancestral greatness. Bardic performances that once entertained royal courts find new audiences in village gatherings, where the need for inspiration burns as brightly as ever. Tales of ancient victories provide comfort during times of uncertainty, while stories of wise kings offer guidance for present challenges. The repertoire expands to include new heroes drawn from recent experience, yet the narrative patterns remain consistent with those that shaped the consciousness of earlier generations. Musical heritage that evolved in royal courts adapts to serve humbler venues, while retaining its capacity to evoke memories of vanished splendor. Drums that once announced the arrival of foreign ambassadors now mark the rhythm of processions. Lyres that accompanied praise songs for conquering emperors provide melodies for hymns that celebrate spiritual rather than temporal victories. The instruments may serve different purposes, but the essence they carry remains essentially unchanged. Ceremonial occasions that once marked the rhythm of royal life transform into festivals that bind neighborhoods together through shared celebration. Harvest festivals replace coronation ceremonies, yet they maintain the same essential function of creating solidarity through collective ritual. Saints' Day observances take the place of victory parades, offering settlements opportunities to express pride in their heritage while acknowledging their dependence on divine protection. Marriage alliances that once bound distant provinces to central control evolve into networks of kinship that preserve social coherence despite fragmentation. Noble families that trace their descent from royal courtiers maintain their status through careful cultivation of genealogical memory and strategic intermarriage. Regional strongmen who emerge from the chaos of collapse legitimize their dominion by claiming connection, however tenuous, to the bloodlines that once ruled from Aksum's palaces. What were once used to prove the right to rule now become cherished keepsakes, preserving the memory of a better past. Family stories linking generations to ancient heroes offer comfort in uncertain times and help keep alive a sense of pride and honor. Marriages, once arranged to shape the fate of whole regions, now aim to protect the legacy, both in name and spirit, of lost greatness. Commercial activity persists on a reduced scale as neighborhood markets replace international networks in meeting daily needs. Merchants who once carried goods across continents adapt to serving regional customers with products drawn from familiar sources. Trading routes that connected highlands to coasts continue to function, though they carry humbler cargoes and serve smaller ambitions than in the days when African goods reached markets in Constantinople and Baghdad. Craft guilds that once competed for royal patronage reorganized themselves around neighborhood needs, while preserving the technical knowledge that distinguishes professional work from amateur effort. Smiths who forged weapons for expeditionary forces adapt their skills to creating agricultural tools and household items. Weavers who produce textiles for export markets focus on supplying clothing for their immediate neighbors, while maintaining the artistic standards that reflect their identity. Artistic practices that develop to serve royal tastes continue in modified form, their techniques preserved by artisans who train apprentices in skills that may someday prove valuable again when prosperity returns. Sculpture that once adorned palaces finds expression in the decoration of houses of worship, while painting that celebrated royal victories adapts to illustrate biblical stories and saintly legends. The aesthetic sensibilities remain consistent even as their applications change to serve new patrons and purposes. Agricultural innovation, accelerated by necessity, helps settlements adapt to reduced circumstances while maintaining adequate nutrition. Farmers, who can no longer depend on imported grain varieties, develop strains better suited to changing conditions. Terracing techniques refined over generations enable maximum productivity from limited land while conserving precious soil. Water management systems that served royal estates prove equally valuable for village settlements that inherit the infrastructure without the bureaucracy that created it. Botanical knowledge that accumulated through centuries of cultivation and experimentation continues to serve settlements that must achieve self-sufficiency in food production. Gardens that once supplied exotic ingredients for royal banquets adapt to growing medicinal herbs and nutritious vegetables for neighborhood consumption. Seed preservation techniques that ensured continuity of favored varieties become crucial skills for maintaining agricultural diversity in the face of environmental challenges. Animal husbandry practices that once supported royal stables and hunting preserves focus on breeds that provide maximum utility for village economies. Cattle breeding that once emphasized appearance for ceremonial purposes shifts toward animals that combine milk production with draft capability. Poultry raising that supplied delicacies for palace tables concentrates on hardy varieties that thrive under minimal care while providing reliable protein sources. Legal practices that emerged from the synthesis of royal law and regional custom persist in the judgments of village elders and clerical leaders. Courts that once applied complex codes designed for governing diverse populations simplify their procedures while maintaining essential principles of justice and harmony. The wisdom accumulated through centuries of jurisprudence adapts to serve humbler circumstances without losing its fundamental character. Dispute resolution mechanisms that once required elaborate bureaucratic procedures evolve into streamlined processes that serve the immediate needs of small settlements. Mediation techniques that prevented conflicts between provinces find new applications in resolving neighborhood disagreements. Property laws that governed vast estates adapt to address the ownership questions that arise in village contexts where everyone knows everyone else's business. Criminal justice systems that once dealt with international crimes and political offenses focus on maintaining order within tight-knit groups, where social pressure provides powerful incentives for conformity. Punishment practices that once emphasized public spectacle evolve toward restorative approaches that rebuild relationships rather than simply deterring misconduct. The underlying principles remain consistent with ancient precedents, but their application reflects the intimate scale of village life. Educational systems that trained administrators for royal service evolved to meet the different needs of settlements that must govern themselves. Ecclesiastical schools that once prepared students for careers in distant capitals focus on developing guidance capable of maintaining essential services. Reading instruction, while less widespread than during the Age of Emperors, continues in centers that recognize knowledge as a treasure worth preserving through whatever trials the future may bring. Curriculum development that once emphasized preparation for governmental careers adapts to serve the practical needs of agricultural settlements. Mathematical instruction that prepared tax collectors and treasury officials finds new applications in land measurement and commercial calculations. Language studies that enable diplomatic correspondence focus on preserving literacy in scripts that contain the memory of the people. Libraries that once housed comprehensive collections of works from across the known world concentrate their reduced resources on preserving texts that serve immediate spiritual and practical needs. Copying programs that once reproduced luxury manuscripts for wealthy patrons focus on multiplying essential texts that ensure the persistence of crucial knowledge. Scholarly activities that once contributed to international intellectual exchanges turn inward to serve the needs of inquiry and education within their immediate regions. Medical knowledge that accumulated through contact with healing practices from across the known world finds new applications in serving settlements that lack access to exotic remedies. Healers who studied their craft in cosmopolitan medical centers adapt their skills to utilize native plants and minerals. Public health practices that prevented disease in crowded urban centers prove equally valuable in smaller settlements that face different but no less serious health challenges. Pharmaceutical knowledge that once relied on imported ingredients adapts to exploit resources that provide similar therapeutic benefits. Surgical techniques that developed in royal hospitals find applications in treating injuries that result from agricultural accidents and neighborhood conflicts. Diagnostic skills that once served wealthy patients prove equally valuable in maintaining the health of populations whose existence depends on the productive capacity of every individual. Preventive medicine that once protected royal households from epidemic diseases adapts to serve village needs for maintaining general health. Sanitation practices that kept cities clean find new applications in preventing contamination of water sources and food supplies. Nutritional knowledge that once optimized the diets of elite athletes focuses on ensuring adequate nourishment for populations that face periodic shortages and limited variety in their food sources. Metallurgical expertise that once produced weapons and tools for royal armies continues to serve settlements that need agricultural implements and domestic utensils. Smiths who forged swords for expeditionary forces adapt their skills to creating plowshares and cooking pots. Mining techniques that extracted precious metals for royal treasuries find new applications in quarrying building stone and extracting iron for essential tools. Smelting operations that once supplied bronze for ceremonial objects focus on producing iron for practical applications. Alloy knowledge that created decorative metals for luxury goods adapts to improving the durability and efficiency of agricultural tools. Metalworking expertise that emphasized artistic beauty learns to balance aesthetic considerations with functional requirements in creating objects that serve daily needs. Toolmaking skills that once created specialized instruments for royal workshops concentrate on producing versatile implements that serve multiple purposes in resource-constrained environments. Weapons smithing knowledge that forged arms for professional soldiers adapts to creating hunting equipment and defensive tools for village militias. The technical expertise remains at high levels, but its applications shift to serve the practical needs of agricultural settlements. Building knowledge that raised monuments to royal glory proves equally valuable in constructing houses of worship and buildings that serve the needs of reduced populations. Stonemasons who mastered their craft working on sovereign palaces apply their skills to creating structures that, while more modest in scale, maintain the standards of excellence that distinguish true civilization from mere existence. Architectural principles that once governed the construction of palaces adapt to serve the requirements of worship spaces and centers. Engineering knowledge that moved massive stones for royal monuments finds applications in building mills granaries, and workshops that serve village economies. Decorative techniques that once adorned royal residences bring beauty to humbler structures while preserving artistic practices that define identity. Construction management skills that once coordinated massive building projects adapt to organizing efforts that accomplish necessary infrastructure improvements. Planning expertise that once designed urban complexes focuses on creating village layouts that maximize efficiency while maintaining social cohesion. Material science knowledge that selected stones and mortars for monuments applies to choosing building materials that provide durability within limited budgets. As the 9th century approaches its conclusion, the structure that once projected African dominion across continents has yielded to a collection of regional strongholds that maintain coherence while exercising only neighborhood rule. The transformation represents not mere decay, but adaptation, the persistence of essential elements through a period of necessary contraction that preserves possibilities for future renewal. Seeds of future greatness lie dormant in the soil that collapse has enriched with the decomposed remains of vanished glory. Ecclesiastical institutions that maintain their integrity through the crisis possess the organizational skills and moral standing needed to support new forms of expression. Heritage that endured the wreckage of dominion carries within it the memory of achievements that may inspire fresh attempts at greatness when circumstances permit. Settlements that mastered self-rule during the twilight have developed capacities for self-reliance and initiative that may prove more valuable than the passive dependence that characterized some royal subjects. Regional variations that emerged during this period create diversity that could enrich whatever larger unity may eventually emerge from the current fragmentation. A shift is underway, opening the way for new dynasties to attempt a revival of Aksum's glory under different names and in modified forms. The Zagwe rulers who await their moment in history will discover in these persistent settlements the human resources and foundations needed to build fresh expressions of African greatness. What appears to be an ending reveals itself as a transformation, the metamorphosis that enables ancient civilizations to renew themselves in forms adapted to changing circumstances while preserving the essential elements that define their identity. Stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, while mortal men below ponder the mysteries of glory that rises like morning mist and vanishes like evening shadows. In chambers where lamplight flickers against carved stone walls, where the scent of frankincense mingles with whispered prayers, scholars gather to trace the threads that bind present to past, seeking wisdom in the ashes of dominions that once commanded the respect of the known world. The name of the Highland realm echoes still through these halls of remembrance, carried on voices that recall when kings spoke as equals to Caesar and Shah. Long after collapse, the surviving words tell of a kingdom that stood with history's most powerful. The respect it commands in these records feels earned, not merely offered for show. It built its reputation not just with armies, but through remarkable leadership, trade success, and administrative brilliance. Its place beside Rome, Persia, and China marks a legacy that later eras would find hard to fully understand. Ancient geographers, whose maps guided merchants across dangerous seas, mark the Highland ports with symbols that denote major centers of international exchange. Their calculations of distances and sailing times treat these harbors as essential waypoints in networks that connected 3 continents. The precision of their measurements reflects first-hand knowledge gained through repeated voyages to shores where goods entered the bloodstream of global commerce. Diplomatic correspondence that once flowed between distant capitals preserves evidence of negotiations conducted between equals. Persian officials who maintained embassies at the royal court wrote reports that survive in fragments scattered across libraries from Constantinople to Baghdad. Their dispatches describe ceremonial occasions where sovereigns displayed wealth and sophistication that impressed representatives of the most ancient realms. Treaties negotiated between these forces established boundaries and commercial agreements that endured for generations. Byzantine theological treatises that debated questions of doctrine reference Highland bishops whose learning commanded international respect. Their participation in councils that determined the fundamental beliefs of the Eastern churches demonstrates intellectual excellence that transcended geographical boundaries. The doctrinal positions they defended influenced developments throughout the Christian world, their arguments preserving influence that outlasted their temporal dominion. Greek merchants whose journals recorded the profits and perils of Red Sea commerce describe markets where ivory commanded prices that enriched entire dynasties. Their careful notations of weights, measures, and exchange rates provide glimpses into economic systems whose sophistication rivaled anything known in the Mediterranean world. The commercial practices they documented reveal regulatory frameworks that protected honest dealers while punishing fraud with severity that maintained market confidence. Even Persian chroniclers, typically devoted to glorifying their own sovereigns, recognized the Highland triumphs that shifted the region's power dynamics. In recounting battles waged on Arabian ground, they noted clever maneuvers that bested troops schooled in the elite martial traditions of the ancient world. The deference they show toward Highland commanders reveals a seasoned respect from veterans who knew just how hard it was to lead campaigns across enemy waters. Monumental testimony carved in stone proclaims triumphs that no enemy could erase and no time could diminish. The great stelae that pierce the Highland sky like spears thrust toward heaven carry messages that speak to generations yet unborn. Their granite surfaces bear inscriptions that record victories over enemies whose names have otherwise vanished from recollection. Conquests that extended royal dominion to lands whose locations can only be guessed from fragmentary references. Underground chambers that house the remains of forgotten sovereigns preserve treasures that demonstrate wealth accumulated through centuries of successful governance. Golden vessels whose craftsmanship rivals the finest products of Alexandria or Antioch fill burial chambers carved from living rock. Ivory carvings that depict scenes of royal triumph provide artistic evidence of excellence that flourished under Highland patronage. Bronze weapons, whose edges remain sharp after centuries in the earth, testify to metallurgical skills that equipped armies capable of conquering distant territories. Royal tombs that escape the attention of treasure seekers preserve collections of foreign goods that reveal the extent of international exchange. Silk from China, glassware from Syria, spices from India. These exotic imports demonstrate commercial networks that spanned the known world. The careful arrangement of these burial goods suggests ceremonial practices that honored the dead while displaying the wealth their leadership had accumulated for their successors. Architectural triumphs that defy easy explanation continue to astound visitors who witness their massive scale and precise construction. The techniques required to quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing dozens of tons represent engineering knowledge that rivals anything accomplished in the ancient world. The mathematical precision evident in their placement reveals understanding of principles that enabled construction projects whose ambition exceeded their builders' apparent resources. Ecclesiastical structures carved directly from mountainsides demonstrate mastery of rock-cutting techniques that transformed solid stone into spaces fit for divine worship. The acoustic properties of these underground chambers create resonances that amplify prayers and hymns. with effects that seem almost supernatural. The artistic decoration that adorns their walls combines Christian symbolism with indigenous motifs in patterns that speak to souls across boundaries. Coinage that bears the images and inscriptions of Highland sovereigns circulated throughout trading networks that connected regions to Asia and Europe. The weight standards and metal purity of these specimens matched or exceeded the quality maintained by older realms, establishing royal currency as acceptable medium of exchange in markets from Alexandria to Constantinople. The artistic sophistication evident in their design reflects excellence that commanded international recognition. Monetary innovations that facilitated complex commercial transactions reveal economic thinking that anticipated developments other realms would not accomplish for centuries. The systematic relationship between gold, silver, and bronze denominations created flexible systems that served needs ranging from major international contracts to daily neighborhood purchases. The longevity of these monetary standards demonstrates governmental stability that maintained public confidence through decades of political and military challenges. Ge'ez script that evolved from foreign models into distinctly Highland forms of expression provided the foundation for literary excellence that enriched the spiritual and intellectual life of the mountain peoples. The translations of biblical texts into this indigenous language created literature that preserved Christian doctrine while adapting it to local contexts. The chronicles composed in this script recorded historical events with detail that provides invaluable insights into the consciousness of a people who considered themselves equals to any nation on earth. Literary works that flourished under royal patronage produced compositions whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of the Highland realm. Epic poems that celebrated heroic deeds inspired similar compositions throughout the Christian world. Doctrinal treatises that explored complex questions of faith and practice influenced thinking in monasteries and universities across 3 continents. The rhetorical sophistication evident in these works demonstrates educational excellence that prepared Highland scholars to participate as equals in international intellectual exchanges. Sacred music that developed in Highland churches created liturgical customs whose beauty attracted pilgrims from distant lands. The harmonic complexity of these compositions reflects musical understanding that synthesized influences from multiple sources while maintaining distinctly regional characteristics. The emotional force of these sacred songs provided spiritual experiences that transcended linguistic and social barriers, creating bonds between diverse communities united in common faith. Doctrinal scholarship that emerged from Highland monasteries contributed to debates that shaped the development of Eastern Christianity. The positions defended by mountain theologians influenced decisions made in councils that determined Orthodox belief throughout the Byzantine sphere. The intellectual rigor evident in their arguments demonstrates educational standards that equipped Highland clergy to hold their own in disputes with the most learned doctors of the Church. Legal innovations that synthesized Roman jurisprudence with indigenous customs created hybrid systems that served diverse populations while maintaining essential principles of justice. The codes developed under Highland auspices provided frameworks for governing territories that spanned multiple ethnic groups and social conventions. The sophistication of these legal structures demonstrates governmental capabilities that enabled effective administration of vast domains through methods that balanced central control with regional autonomy. Commercial law that regulated international exchange established standards that protected merchants while encouraging commerce across social and spiritual boundaries. The contractual forms developed under Highland oversight provided templates that enabled complex transactions between parties who spoke different languages and followed different customs. The longevity of these commercial practices demonstrates their effectiveness in facilitating peaceful exchange in regions where conflict might otherwise have disrupted economic activity. Diplomatic protocols that governed relations with foreign nations established precedents that influenced international relations throughout the Red Sea region. The ceremonial practices developed at the Highland court provided models that other rulers adopted when establishing their own claims to supremacy. The sophistication of these diplomatic customs demonstrates excellence that commanded respect from realms whose own protocols had evolved over centuries of international experience. Marriage alliances that bound the Highland royal family to dynasties throughout the region created kinship networks that influenced political developments long after the collapse of central control. The genealogical claims that descended from these unions provided legitimacy for rulers who sought to revive mountain splendor under new names and different forms. The persistence of these bloodline connections demonstrates the enduring influence of Highland excellence on the political imagination of subsequent generations. Social synthesis that characterized Highland society at its height provided models for integration that influenced development throughout northeastern regions. The methods by which diverse populations were incorporated into unified political structures without sacrificing their essential identities offered alternatives to the assimilationist or segregationist approaches that characterized other dominions. The success of these integrative policies demonstrates governmental wisdom that recognized diversity as strength rather than weakness. Artistic triumphs that flourished under Highland patronage established aesthetic standards that influenced creative expression throughout the region. The sculptural forms that decorated royal monuments provided inspiration for artists whose works adorned churches and palaces across the mountain territories. The stylistic innovations that emerged from the fusion of multiple influences created distinctly Highland art forms whose beauty transcended their original contexts. Sacred structures that combined Christian symbolism with indigenous building customs created worship spaces whose spiritual force inspired devotion across boundaries. The engineering innovations that enabled construction of churches carved from solid rock demonstrated technical capabilities that exceeded anything accomplished by contemporary realms. The aesthetic impact of these building triumphs created spiritual experiences that attracted pilgrims from throughout the Christian world. Agricultural innovations that enabled intensive cultivation of highland territories provided food security that supported urban populations and professional armies. The terracing techniques that maximized productivity from limited arable land created landscapes whose beauty complemented their functionality. The water management systems that distributed rainfall efficiently throughout cultivated areas demonstrated engineering knowledge that sustained prosperity through climatic variations that might otherwise have caused famine. Military innovations that enabled projection of Highland force across vast distances established tactical customs that influenced warfare throughout the region. The organizational methods that maintained discipline and morale among troops operating far from their homelands provided models that other rulers attempted to replicate. The technological advances that equipped Highland forces with superior weapons and armor demonstrated metallurgical capabilities that gave mountain armies advantages over enemies who possessed greater numbers but inferior equipment. Educational systems that prepared administrators for royal service created intellectual customs that preserved knowledge through periods of political instability. The schools that trained Highland bureaucrats established standards of literacy and numeracy that enabled effective governance of complex territories. The scholarly practices that emerged from these educational institutions contributed to intellectual developments that enriched the life of the broader region. Commercial networks that connected Highland territories to markets throughout the known world established relationships that persisted long after political control contracted. The reputation for honesty and reliability that Highland merchants earned in foreign markets created goodwill that benefited subsequent generations of traders. The commercial practices that regulated these international exchanges provided frameworks that enabled peaceful interaction between peoples who might otherwise have viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. Technological advances that characterized Highland society at its peak provided foundations for developments that continued to benefit mountain populations long after imperial glory faded. The metallurgical knowledge that enabled production of superior tools and weapons remained available to craftsmen who adapted their skills to serve more modest markets. The engineering expertise that created monuments and infrastructure projects provided capabilities that enabled construction and maintenance of essential facilities. Spiritual customs that took root during the period of Highland dominance provided foundations that sustained communities through subsequent trials and transformations. The insights that emerged from the encounter between Christian doctrine and indigenous wisdom created synthetic forms of faith that spoke to mountain souls while maintaining connection to universal truths. The liturgical practices that developed in Highland churches provided frameworks for worship that preserved identity while expressing commitment to shared beliefs. Heritage that flows from these accomplishments transcends the political boundaries that contained their original expression. The recollection of Highland sovereignty that commanded respect from the greatest forces of antiquity provides inspiration for subsequent generations who seek to recover their own claims to excellence. The evidence of advancement that rivals anything accomplished in the ancient world demonstrates capabilities that challenge assumptions about the relationship between geography and refinement. Stories that preserve the recollection of Highland splendor continue to inspire those who hear them recounted around evening fires, or whispered in sacred spaces where the past speaks to the present. The legends that grew from historical accomplishments create mythologies that provide meaning and purpose for communities that struggle to understand their place in a world that has forgotten their ancestors' triumphs. The emotional force of these narratives transcends their historical accuracy, providing spiritual nourishment that sustains hope through periods of difficulty and uncertainty. Sacred geography that accumulated spiritual significance during the age of Highland dominance continues to attract pilgrims who seek connection to sources of strength that transcend temporal control. The churches and monasteries that preserve the recollection of vanished splendor provide spaces where the faithful can experience continuity with accomplishments that demonstrated divine favor. The rituals that commemorate past glories create occasions for communities to remember their heritage while renewing their commitment to the values that made excellence possible. Future generations who inherit this heritage will find in it resources for accomplishments that may exceed anything achieved by their ancestors. The governmental customs that enabled effective administration of vast territories provide models that can be adapted to serve new purposes and different circumstances. The social synthesis that created Highland society offers templates for integration that remain relevant to communities that must unite diverse populations while respecting their distinctive contributions. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, where morning stars fade into dawn's early light, the seeds of renewal wait for seasons when they may again take root and flourish. The collapse of political structures that once projected Highland dominion across continents clears ground for fresh growth that may surpass anything the past accomplished. What appears to be an ending reveals itself as a beginning, the eternal cycle through which societies renew themselves while preserving the essential elements that define their deepest identity. Thus concludes the tale of the Highland realm's rise and transformation, of mountain dreams made manifest in monuments that pierce the sky like prayers carved in stone. Though the political structures that sustained this excellence have crumbled into dust, the spirit that animated them endures in the hearts of those who remember when kings spoke as equals to Caesar and Shah, when ships carried the hopes of a continent to markets that spanned the known world, when the very stones of the earth bore witness to splendor that will live as long as recollection itself survives the passage of time.